Imagine being a teenage girl, barely 18 years old, and waking up one morning to find out that your entire future has already been decided. Not by you, not by someone who loves you, but by a room full of old men sitting around a table, moving countries around like pieces on a chessboard. That is exactly what happened to her. She was born in 1791 inside one of the most powerful royal families in all of Europe, the Habsburg family of Austria. From the very first day, she could understand the world around her. She was told one thing over and over again: your life is not your own. You are a princess, and princesses do not get to choose. She grew up in a grand palace in Vienna. Long hallways, high ceilings, servants at every door. From the outside, it looked like a dream. But inside those walls, she was being quietly prepared for something she never asked for. Her days were filled with lessons: French, music, painting, etiquette. Not because anyone wanted her to be happy, but because she needed to be presentable, worthy of being traded. Yes, traded, because that is what happened to royal daughters in those days. They were not seen as people with feelings and dreams. They were seen as tools, political tools, and when the right moment came, they would be handed over to seal a deal between two powerful men. Her moment came sooner than anyone expected. Across Europe, a storm had been brewing for years. A man had risen from nothing, a soldier, a general, a conqueror, and he had turned the entire continent upside down. He had won battles that no one thought could be won. He had marched armies across mountains and deserts. He had made kings tremble and made empires beg. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. By the time she was a child, Napoleon was already the most talked about man in the world. And in their home, the Habsburg Palace in Vienna, he was not admired, it was feared. He was the enemy. The man who had humiliated Austria on the battlefield. The man her family whispered about in cold, bitter tones. She had been raised to fear him, to see him as something dangerous and dark. But life has a cruel sense of humor. In 1809, Napoleon made a decision that would change her life forever. His wife, Josephine, had not been able to give him a child. And for Napoleon, a child, a son, was everything. An heir meant the empire would continue. So he did what powerful men of that era did without much guilt. He ended the marriage. He needed a new wife, a royal wife, someone from a respected bloodline who could give him what Josephine could not. His eyes landed on Austria. The Habsburg family had a daughter of the right age, young, healthy, well-bred, and most importantly, her hand in marriage would mean peace between France and Austria. That was the deal. Give Napoleon this girl, and France would stop threatening Austrian borders. Her father, the Emperor of Austria, agreed. She was never asked. When she found out what had been decided for her, the world she knew collapsed. Everything she had been carefully protected from that man, that enemy, that name she had heard whispered with fear her whole life was now going to be her husband. She was 18 years old. She cried. She wrote letters to her father, begging him, asking him if there was any other way. But the deal was already signed. The carriages were already being prepared. History was moving forward, with or without her tears. So she packed her things and said goodbye to Austria, goodbye to her family, goodbye to the language she knew, the food she loved, the servants who had cared for her since she was a baby. And she crossed the border into France, into a country that did not want her. Because France already had a queen they loved. Josephine had been warm and charming and adored by the French people. They had watched Napoleon push her aside, and they were not happy about it. When this new young wife arrived from Austria, the enemy country, the crowds were polite, but the eyes were cold. She could feel it. She was not welcomed. She was tolerated. She was a stranger in a palace full of people watching her every move. Every word she said was reported. Every expression on her face was studied. She had no real friends, no one she could trust. She was surrounded by people and completely alone at the same time. And then something happened that no one expected. Not her. Not her family back in Vienna. Not the people of France who had already made up their minds about her. She started to fall in love with Napoleon. Not because she had to. Not because she was told to. But because when she hadly met him, this man she had been taught to fear her whole life. He was different from what she had imagined. He was attentive. He was patient with her. He spoke to her gently in the early days of their marriage. He seemed to genuinely enjoy her company. She was young and far from home and desperately lonely. And here was a man, the most powerful man on earth, who was kind to her in private when no one was watching. Slowly, quietly, she let herself care for him. She wrote letters to her father back in Austria. And in those letters, which historians would later find and read, she admitted something that must have surprised even herself. She said she was not unhappy. She said Napoleon treated her well. She even used the word love. She had walked into that marriage terrified, and somewhere along the way, she had found something real. In 1811, she gave birth to a son, a boy. The heir Napoleon had been waiting for his entire adult life. The palace erupted in celebration. Cannons were fired. Church bells rang across Paris. The whole of France celebrated, and for one brief, golden moment, she felt like she actually belonged. She was not just a political tool anymore. She was a mother. She had given the empire its future, and in doing so, she'd carved out a small piece of worth for herself inside these stone walls. But happiness, real happiness, has a way of not lasting very long when it lives inside a palace. Because Napoleon's empire was not built to last. The wars continued. The campaigns kept coming. And slowly, the invincible general who had shaken the world began to lose. Russia was a disaster. Then came more defeats. Tintalis, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, joined forces and closed in from every direction. By 1814, it was over. Napoleon was defeated, abdicated, sent into exile on a small island called Elba. And she, his wife, the woman who had crossed an entire continent to marry him, the woman who had genuinely come to love him, was simply left behind. There was no dramatic farewell. No final meeting. The men who now controlled Europe made their decisions quickly. Napoleon was gone, and she needed to be dealt with. A meeting was arranged in Vienna, the Great Congress of Vienna, where the powerful nations of Europe sat down to redraw the map of the world. And somewhere in between those conversations about borders and thrones, they decided what to do with her too. She would be given a small territory to govern, a place called Parma, in northern Italy. She would be a duchess. She would have a title, a palace, a staff, but she would not see Napoleon again. She was 23 years old. She had a 2-year-old son, and the man she had come to love was being taken away, not by death, but by politics, by the same cold, indifferent force that had brought them together in the first place. She had never been free to choose who she loved, and now she was not free to grieve it either. Parma is a small, quiet place in northern Italy. Green hills, cobblestone streets, people who wake up early, work hard, and go to sleep without worrying too much about the politics of great empires. It was nothing like Paris, nothing like Vienna, and for her, a woman who had lived her entire life inside the machinery of power, it was the strangest place she had ever found herself in. She arrived in Parma in 1814 as its new ruler. Duchess, they called her. She had a palace, a court, and an entire small territory to govern. On paper, it sounded like something, but she knew the truth. This was not a reward. This was a cage with a nicer view. The men who had divided up Europe at the Congress of Vienna had not given her Parma out of kindness. They had given it to her to keep her quiet, to keep her occupied, to make sure she stayed far away from Napoleon and far away from any trouble she might cause if left to her own devices. She understood this. She was not naive. But here's what nobody expected, including herself. She turned out to be genuinely good at it. She threw herself into the work. Not because she had to, but because it was the only thing she had left that was truly hers. Napoleon was gone. Her son was far away. Her family in Vienna was a world of letters and careful words. But Parma was real. The people there had real problems. Broken roads, poor schools, not enough hospitals. So she got to work. She built schools so that children who had never seen the inside of a classroom could learn to read. She supported artists and musicians because she understood, from her own life, how much beauty matters when everything else is falling apart. She improved the roads that connected small villages to the rest of the world. She paid attention to the kind of details that powerful rulers in grand capitals often ignored. Because those rulers never actually had to live among their people, she did. And slowly, something shifted. The people of Parma began to look at her differently, not with suspicion. Not with the cold, distant politeness she had felt in Paris, but with something warmer, something she had almost forgotten existed. They liked her, not because she was an empress, not because of who her husband had been, but because of what she actually did. Because she showed up. Because she cared. For the first time in her life, she was loved not for her bloodline or her political usefulness, but simply for being good to people. It should have been enough. In a fair world, it would have been enough, but the world she lived in was never fair to her. While she was quietly building something real in Parma, the people who controlled her life were quietly making other decisions. Her son, the little boy she had held in that Paris palace, the child Napoleon had wept with joy over who was not with her. He had been taken to Vienna, back into the Habsburg world, and was being raised by her father's court. They called him by an Austrian name. They dressed him in Austrian clothes. They were, piece by piece, removing everything French from him, everything that connected him to his father. She asked for him ordinance, she wrote letters. She made requests through the proper channels, in the careful, diplomatic language that royalty was expected to use. The answer was always some version of no. Not a cruel no. Not a shouted no. Just a quiet, firm, immovable no wrapped in polite words. The kind of refusal that is almost worse than anger because there is nothing to push back against. Just a wall of smiling, reasonable-sounding people telling her that this is simply how things must be. Her son grew up without her, and she was forced to watch it happen from a distance, one letter at a time. This is the part of her story that most people never talk about. They talk about Napoleon. They talk about the politics, the wars, the empire. But they do not talk about a mother who had her child taken away and was told to be grateful for the duchy she had been given in return. Into the loneliness of those early Parma years came a man she had not chosen and had not asked for. He was an Austrian general, polished, experienced, and charming in the way that men trained for courts and campaigns tend to be. He had been assigned to her, sent by the Austrian court, to be her aide, her companion, her advisor. Whether the people who sent him had other intentions in mind is something historians have long argued about, but the effect was the same either way. He was there. Every day, and she was alone. He was kind to her, patient. He paid attention to the things she said and remembered them. He made her feel, in the small everyday moments of life, like she was a person worth caring about. And she, a woman who had been passed from one set of powerful hands to another her entire life, responded to that the way any human being would. She let him in. They had children together, quietly, while Napoleon was still alive on the island of St. Helena, slowly fading away from the world. This is the part of her story that some people judge her harshly for. But judgment is easy when you have not spent your entire life being told who to be, where to go, and how to feel. She was in her mid. She had lost her husband to exile, her son to politics, and her home to history. She was not a villain. She was a person trying to survive. When Napoleon died in 1821 on that distant island, alone and forgotten by the world he had once shaken, she did not mourn publicly. She could not. The courts of Europe were watching. Propriety had to be maintained. Whatever she felt in private, she folded it up and put it somewhere deep inside herself, the way she had learned to do with so many things. She married her companion quietly, and for a few years, she had something that resembled a stable life. Then he died too, in 1829, and she was alone again. She lived for nearly 2 more decades after that. She continued governing Parma. She continued the work she had started: the schools, the roads, the small daily improvements that made life a little better for ordinary people who had no idea what storm she was carrying inside. She took another companion in her later years, another man chosen from the circles around her, another relationship watched and managed by the forces that had never stopped managing her. She was a ruler on paper, but the invisible strings were always there. Her son, the one she had been separated from all those years ago, died in 1832. It was 21 years old. He had grown up in Vienna, trained as a Habsburg, and had never truly been allowed to know either of his parents. He died of illness, young and quietly, in the same palace where his mother had grown up as a girl. She outlived him. There are no words for what that kind of loss does to a person. To bury a child you were never truly allowed to raise. To grieve someone you loved from a distance your entire life, and then lose them before you ever got to close that distance. She kept going, because that is what she had always done. She died in 1847. She was 55 years old. She had been a princess, an empress, a duchess, a mother, and a ruler. She had governed with competence and genuine care. She had loved and lost in ways that most people will never fully understand. The history books remember her mostly as a footnote to Napoleon's story. The second wife, the Austrian girl, the one who came after Josephine. But if you look closer past the politics and the palace walls and the grand events that history loves to record, you find something else entirely. You find a woman who never once got to make her own choices, who was handed from one powerful world to the next, told to smile, told to be grateful, told to be, and who, in the small, quiet corners of her life, in the schools she built, in the letters she wrote, in the love she gave even when it was taken from her, was more human than the world ever gave her credit for. She was a queen, and she deserved so much more than the life she was given.